You know what finally woke me up to how badly we treat our tools? I was cleaning out my grandfather's shop after he passed, and I found a draw knife sitting on a shelf wrapped in an oiled cloth. The edge was still sharp. The handles were tight. The steel had this dark, even patina, but not a spot of rust anywhere on it. That draw knife was made sometime around 1880. My grandfather didn't buy it. His father didn't buy it either. It came down from my great-great-grandfather, a man who settled in eastern Ohio and cleared his own land, with tools he carried in a single chest. That draw knife had been working for over 100 years, and it was ready to work again the moment I picked it up. Meanwhile, I had a cordless drill sitting in my truck that was barely 3 years old and already falling apart. That contrast hit me hard, and it sent me down a path of studying exactly how those early settlers maintained their tools to last not just a lifetime, but 5 generations. Today, I'm going to walk you through the specific methods they used, from rust prevention to handle replacement to storage techniques that most of us have completely forgotten. And stick around to the end, because I'll show you a trick pioneers used to test whether a tool handle was properly seated, using nothing but sound. Let's get into it. What we're really talking about today is a complete system of tool care that American frontier settlers developed out of pure necessity. These weren't collectors preserving museum pieces. These were working people who understood that a well-maintained tool was the difference between survival and failure, and the methods they used are just as effective today as they were 200 years ago. So let me start with where this mindset came from and why it produced tools that could outlast the people who made them. When you think about a settler heading west in the 1830s or 1840s, you have to understand what tools meant to that family. A good set of hand tools. We're talking a broad axe, a felling axe, a draw knife, a set of chisels, a handsaw, a jack plane, maybe an adze. That kit might represent 3 or 4 months of wages. And once you were out on the frontier, you couldn't just ride into town and buy a replacement. The nearest blacksmith might be 40 miles away. A factory-made tool might take months to arrive by freight if it was available at all. So every single tool in that chest had to work perfectly every single day because your shelter, your furniture, your fencing, your barn, all of it depended on those tools functioning. But here's what really struck me when I started researching this. It wasn't just that they took care of their tools because they had to. They developed a genuine philosophy around it. There's a phrase I kept running across in old journals and letters from that period. They'd say, "A man is known by the condition of his tools." It wasn't just practical advice, it was a moral statement. The way you cared for your tools said something about your character, your discipline, your respect for the work. And that philosophy produced specific daily, seasonal, and generational maintenance practices that are remarkably sophisticated when you actually break them down. Let me show you what I mean. The first thing I learned that surprised me was how often pioneers touched their tools. Not used them, touched them, maintained them. Every single evening after work, a settler would wipe down every tool he'd used that day. And I don't mean a quick pass with a rag. This was a deliberate ritual. You'd take a cloth, usually a scrap of wool or linen, lightly dampened with rendered animal fat, and you'd wipe every metal surface on every tool. The blade of the axe, the sole of the plane, the backs of the chisels. Every surface that could rust got a thin film of fat on it before that tool went back in the chest. Now, when I first read about this, I thought it seemed excessive, but then I tried it. I picked 5 hand tools in my shop and committed to wiping them down with a light coat of oil every evening for 1 month. and the difference was startling. Tools I'd been fighting surface rust on for years stayed perfectly clean. The steel actually started developing that same smooth, dark patina I'd seen on my grandfather's draw knife. And here's the thing. It took me about 4 minutes a night. That's it. 4 minutes. The pioneers understood something that most of us have forgotten. Rust doesn't happen in a big, dramatic event. It happens slowly, invisibly, in the hours between when you set a tool down and when you pick it up again. That nightly wipe down was their way of never giving corrosion a foothold. Now, the second method is where it gets really clever, because the pioneers didn't just use any old grease on their tools. They developed specific blends for rust prevention that worked remarkably well. And the main one was a mixture of rendered tallow and beeswax. The typical ratio, based on what I've found in old homesteading manuals and journals, was roughly 3 parts tallow to 1 part beeswax, melted together and allowed to cool into a soft paste. Some families added a small amount of turpentine, maybe a tablespoon per cup of the blend, to help it spread thinner and penetrate into any pitting on the steel. Here's why this worked so well. Tallow by itself is a decent rust inhibitor, but it goes rancid over time and can attract moisture. Beeswax doesn't go rancid, and it creates a harder, more durable barrier. When you combine the two, you get a paste that spreads easily, bonds to the metal surface, doesn't spoil, and creates a breathable moisture barrier that can last weeks between applications. I made a batch of this myself using beef tallow from a local butcher and beeswax from a beekeeper down the road. Total cost was about $4. I've been using that same jar for over a year, and I can tell you honestly, it works better than any commercial rust preventive I've ever bought. The surface it leaves on a hand-plane sole is smooth, slightly waxy, and tools glide across wood beautifully. The settlers would apply this paste 2 or 3 times a year as a deep treatment, working it into the metal with a wool cloth and then buffing it down to a thin film. For tools going into long-term storage over winter, they'd apply a heavier coat and wrap the tool in an oiled cloth. Some families kept a specific piece of sheepskin, wool side in, treated with this tallow and beeswax blend, and they'd slide bladed tools into it like a sheath. I tried that with a 2-inch chisel and a piece of sheepskin from a craft store, and after 6 months in an unheated garage, the chisel came out looking exactly the way it went in. Not a trace of rust. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Old Ways, and it is a collection of 100 forgotten woodworking secrets from traditional craftsmen around the world. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now, once I understood how the settlers protected their steel, the next thing I wanted to learn was how they handled the part of the tool that actually fails most often, the handle. And this is where I realized how completely different their approach was from ours. Today, when a handle cracks or loosens, most of us go buy a replacement handle at the hardware store, jam it on, and hope for the best. The pioneers treated handle making and handle replacement as a serious craft in its own right, because they understood that the handle is not just a way to hold the tool. It's the connection between your body and the cutting edge, and if that connection fails, you can get hurt. The first thing they did was select their handle wood with extreme care. For striking tools like axes and hammers, the almost universal choice was hickory, specifically second-growth hickory, which has tighter growth rings and more consistent grain than old-growth timber. For tools that needed a lighter touch, like chisels and draw knives, they'd often use white ash or sometimes white oak. And here's the detail that matters most. They never used wood from a lumberyard for handles. They split their handle blanks from a log, following the grain, rather than sawing them. A split blank has continuous grain fibers running the full length of the handle. A sawn blank almost always has some runout where the grain angles off to one side, and that's exactly where handles break. Once they had a split blank, they'd rough shape it with a draw knife, then let it season for at least 6 months, sometimes a full year, in a dry location. They wanted that wood down to about 8 or 9% moisture content before they did the final shaping. The final fitting was done carefully, with the handle shaped to fit the eye of the tool precisely. They didn't use epoxy. They didn't even rely primarily on wedges, though they used them. The primary holding force was a friction fit so tight that you could barely press the handle into the eye by hand. The wedge, usually a thin piece of dried hardwood, was there to add insurance, not to compensate for a sloppy fit. And here's a detail I love. Many settlers would soak the top 3 inches of a new handle in hot linseed oil for about 10 minutes before the final seating. The oil would penetrate into the end grain and the fibers right at the joint, and as it dried and polymerized over the following weeks, it would swell the wood slightly and then lock it in place. I've started doing this on every handle I replace, and I haven't had a loose head in over 2 years. This next method is the one that really changed my daily routine because it's about sharpening. The pioneers didn't think of sharpening the way most of us do. We tend to use our tools until they're dull, then spend 20 or 30 minutes at the grinder and the stones trying to bring them back. The settlers sharpened constantly, but for very short intervals. It was maintenance sharpening, not rescue sharpening, and the difference is enormous. A typical pioneer woodworker would carry a small, fine grit natural stone in his pocket or in a leather pouch on his belt. Every 30 to 45 minutes of active work, he'd stop, take maybe 60 to 90 seconds, and give his edge tool a few passes on that stone. Not a full resharpening, just a quick honing to maintain the edge before it had a chance to degrade. Think of it like this. If you strop a chisel before it gets dull, you're removing a tiny amount of metal and keeping the edge geometry intact. If you wait until it's dull, you're removing a lot of metal, trying to reestablish an edge that's already rounded over. I tested this for a month. Instead of sharpening when a tool felt dull, I set a timer and honed every 30 minutes of use. Just a few light passes on a fine Arkansas stone. At the end of that month, my edges were consistently sharper than they'd ever been, and I'd actually removed less total metal from my tools than I normally would in the same period. The pioneers knew that a sharp tool is a safe tool, and they knew that keeping an edge is always easier than making one. Their stones weren't fancy. A good, hard Arkansas stone or an equivalent natural stone was the standard. They'd keep it lightly oiled, and that was the entire sharpening kit for daily use. A coarser stone stayed back at the shop for the occasional repair or regrinding, but it rarely came out if you were disciplined about daily honing. Now, the 5th method I want to share with you is about storage, and this one surprised me more than anything else. The Pioneer toolbox wasn't just a container, it was a climate control system. When you look at a well-made 19th century tool chest, you'll notice some very specific design features. The chest was typically made from white pine or tulip poplar, softwoods that absorb and release moisture gradually. The inside was often lined with a thin layer of wool felt, sometimes treated with that same tallow and beeswax blend. and the lid was fitted tightly enough to create a semi-sealed environment, but not so tight that air couldn't exchange slowly. What this did was buffer humidity changes. When the air outside the chest got humid, the wooden walls and the wool lining would absorb some of that moisture before it could reach the tools. When the air dried out, the chest would release moisture gradually instead of letting the tools experience a rapid swing. The pioneers in the Ohio River Valley and the upper Midwest were dealing with humidity swings from 20% in winter to 80% in summer. Those are brutal conditions for bare steel. But inside a properly made tool chest, the effective humidity swing. The tools experienced was much smaller, maybe 35 to 55%. Some settlers also placed small linen bags filled with quicklime or wood ash inside the chest as desiccants, replacing them every few months. I tried this with a small tool cabinet in my shop using bags of calcium chloride from the hardware store, which works on the same principle. Over a full year, the tools stored in that cabinet had noticeably less surface oxidation than identical tools stored on open shelves 10 feet away. The last method is really about mindset, and it ties everything together. Pioneers didn't just maintain their tools, they passed them down with intention. When a father gave his son a set of tools, it was a significant event, and it usually came with direct instruction, not just in how to use the tools, but in how to care for them. There are letters and journal entries from the 1840s and 1850s where fathers describe spending entire winter evenings teaching a son how to dress a handle, how to mix the tallow paste, how to read the color of steel to know if it's been overheated on a grindstone. The tools carried knowledge with them. Each generation received not just the physical object, but the complete maintenance system that kept it alive. That's why some of these tools survived 5 generations. It wasn't luck. It was a chain of knowledge, each link as important as the last. Let me share some patterns I've noticed in how most of us handle tools today. Things I did myself for years that the pioneers would have found baffling. The first pattern is reactive maintenance. We wait until something goes wrong before we act. A chisel gets rusty, so we clean it. A handle gets loose, so we shim it. A blade gets dull, so we grind it. Every single one of those problems was avoidable with a few minutes of preventive care, but we've gotten into the habit of ignoring tools until they demand attention. The second pattern is treating handles as disposable. When a handle cracks, we buy a factory-made replacement, which was sawn from kiln-dried wood with no attention to grain orientation, and we wonder why it breaks again in 2 years. The pioneers would spend a full day making a handle because they knew a good handle was worth that investment many times over. The third pattern is over-reliance on chemical products. We buy rust inhibitors, handle conditioners, blade coatings, sharpening systems, all these specialized products, when the settlers achieved the same or better results with tallow, beeswax, linseed oil, and a good stone. I'm not saying modern products are bad. Some of them are excellent. But we've lost the understanding of the simple principles that make them work, and that means we use them poorly. The fourth pattern is open storage. Most of us hang our tools on a pegboard or toss them in an open drawer. The pioneers understood that unprotected steel in an uncontrolled environment is steel that's actively rusting. Even a simple wooden box with a decent lid makes a meaningful difference. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. You don't have to build a full Pioneer tool chest tomorrow. Just start wiping down your tools tonight. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I found referenced in a homesteader's journal from 1853, and I've never seen it in any modern woodworking book. When pioneers seated a new handle into an axe head or a hammer, they had a way to test whether the fit was right before they drove the final wedge. They'd hold the tool by the very end of the handle, letting it hang freely, and then tap the side of the metal head with a knuckle. If the handle was seated tightly and the grain was running true, the tool would ring with a clear, sustained tone, almost like tapping a bell. If the fit was loose or if there was a hidden crack in the handle, the sound would be dead and flat, a dull thud instead of a ring. I've tested this on every handle I've replaced in the last 2 years, and it's remarkably reliable. A good fit rings, a bad fit thuds. It takes 2 seconds, and it's caught problems for me twice that I wouldn't have noticed visually. Once was a hairline crack inside the eye that I couldn't see, and once was a handle that felt tight, but actually had a small gap on one side. Both times, the sound told me before failure did. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Old Ways. 100 techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with step-by-step photos and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one.